Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander. Episode 82, Imitating Alexander. Today, we'll see Antiochus III imitate Alexander the Great, or at least parallel him. This includes a voyage back towards the subcontinent which comes at the end of Alexander's life, India. Yes, you heard me correctly, India. We haven't properly dealt with the Indian subcontinent since the days of Antiochus II in our episode King of the Yavanas. Before then, the last time a Seleucid interacted with India in a meaningful way was, if memory serves, Seleucus I getting 500 war elephants off Chandragupta Maurya. To give you some sense of perspective, this was before the Battle of Ipsus, itself now almost 100 years in the past from our perspective. So, let's turn our eyes to the east and prepare to go back. The Seleucid forces headed south from the Bactrian kingdom and travelled across the Hindu Kush. Antiochus soon arrived in the valley of Kabul in modern-day Afghanistan. Now, India was no longer united by this point. It had been fragmented by the death of its emperor Ashoka, who we last mentioned in the episode King of the Yavanas. Instead, Antiochus III treated with an Indian king by the name of Sophaxenus. This might sound like a mouthful. However, we're more than familiar at this point with the Hellenistic people mangling the names of foreign rulers in trying to get them to cooperate with Greek phonics. Now, web searching wasn't able to tell me who this king actually was initially, and Bevan is equally silent on the matter. So I turned to other sources. Wikipedia gave me a Mauryan emperor by the name of Shallishuka who reigned over the Mauryan Empire at the time, being king from 215 to 202. This name has at least some cursory similarities with Sophaxenus, but this doesn't seem conclusive enough. Now, George Rawlinson touches on the question in his History of Parthia. However, he identifies our mystery ruler as being the grandson of Chandragupta Maurya. However, that honour belongs to Ashoka himself, as we've covered in previous episodes, leaving us no closer to the actual truth. However, there is a footnote identifying this mystery king as Jaloka, a son of Ashoka. This Jalauka is corroborated on Wikipedia as being a king of Kashmir at the time. So, that seems good enough for me. I'm going to call him Jalauka from now on. This is only consistent in my mind because, after all, we weren't referring to Chandragupta Maurya as Androkotos or Sandrakotos in the early stages of our narrative. Anyway, on with the story. Jalauka was suitably impressed by the Seleucid might to hand over elephants and supplies, as well as pledging more riches to come. Basically, Jalauka is acknowledging that Antiochus III is his better. Antiochus appears to have been satisfied with this as he turned around and went home. He delegated the task of eventually collecting Jalauka's promised treasure, once it had been raised, to a man called Androsthenes. For his part, Antiochus himself travelled overland back towards the west, wintering in a region called Carmania for the winter of 206 BCE. Now, is anyone else thinking this at least somewhat parallels the journey of Alexander? Maybe it just feels strange to have a king this far east again. Anyway, once 205 BCE arrived, Antiochus headed back towards the Tigris River and towards Babylon. Now, this is where I tell you that my comment about Alexander from earlier wasn't actually that far-fetched, seeing as Bevan himself draws the comparison at this point. Just like Alexander, Antiochus' focus swung south towards Arabia once he'd arrived back in Babylon. I dug into the primary sources for this a little bit, and indeed, in his Anabasis chapter 19, Arrian mentions that Alexander the Great had prepared a fleet with which to attack the Arabians. His motives were supposedly conquest, just as they always were. So too, Antiochus' attentions now moved south. His fleet travelled from the Tigris River towards the coast of Arabia. His aim is described as being subjugating somewhere called Gerha. Gerha was a nexus in the spice trade, with roads leading towards Petra, Medina, and Mecca. Incidentally, note the mention of Mecca more than 800 years before the Prophet Muhammad will leave there for Medina in 622 CE. Anyway, back in the 3rd century BCE, Antiochus soon dismissed the idea of permanent conquest once he was in Arabia itself. Therefore, when a missive from the rulers of Gerha begged him for peace, Antiochus made do with extracting tribute, and then travelling back towards Seleucia on the Tigris via Tylos. This brings us to the year 205 to 204 BCE. Antiochus III has been king for nearly 20 years. Bevan points out how glorious this eastern adventure seemed. After all, the Seleucid house had been at rock bottom not too long ago, and now Antiochus III had clawed back the possessions of Seleucus II and even Antiochus II. However, Bevan points out the Seleucids had not built up full-time sovereignty beyond the periphery of their empire. In other words, this is reconquest rather than new conquest. The rule of the House of Seleucus only carried on for as long as there was a strong king prepared to enforce it with the business end of an army. That said, Antiochus is said by Bevan to be wise to know his limits and not keep pushing. From my own perspective, given that Alexander's army turned him around forcefully after pushing deep into India, perhaps we can say that Antiochus III did what Alexander III could not do. He knew his limits and turned around. Next time, we will also turn around and move our attention away from the east and towards the west. It's time for the Middle East to become a source of contention once more. Until then, thank you all for listening. Feel free to get in touch at the show's email address for any questions or comments. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.